we don't have any quick business? We're okay with the,
I don't think so. I think we can go.
who really needs no introduction. He has been an ambassador in our sport now this will probably be a problem too. Over 30 years, over 40 years, I don't know. You've been doing this.
47.
He's a guide, fly designer, shop owner, writer, TV host, currently the owner of the Slide Inn on the Madison River in Montana. And I have it on good authority by a mutual friend of ours, Rich in Billings at East Rosebud, that he goes by the alias of Streamer Mr. Kelly.
Only at Rich's shop.
Yeah. So Kelly, thank you for taking the time to entertain us tonight. We look forward to it. And the floor is yours, sir.
I'll keep it as brief as I can. Like I said, this is pretty hard for me to, I talk a lot. So welcome to the house. We're over here in Montana. I'm going to switch over here to the screen so we can get right at it because I really do talk a lot. Way too much, I'm sure. But we'll get to this. And at any point you want to interrupt, and anytime you want to start, just say, just interrupt, because it's really, these things are really difficult with without having, interaction from the crowd here. But I got to get to this. Hey, where'd it go? Sorry, we're already having technical difficulties. I'm trying to get this thing from the beginning. So there we go. All right, everything copacetic here?
Very good.
Everybody's ready to roll? No problem. You can't see me, so I can leave just in case I need a break. We're going to go over, I'm going to start this out. I'm going to run you through some stuff, and I'm going to take you through a lot of stuff pretty quick because I don't want to bore anybody to death. But it seems how at one point in my career early on, I told Mark this, that 72% of my client base in Michigan came from the North Shore, Chicago, or thereabouts. So I wish I could remember everybody's name so I could pick on somebody. I don't know anybody. So can I remember everybody? So Mark's going to be the victim. At any rate, you asked me about, this is Chad. These are the two guys, Alex Lufkus and Chad Johnson. That's on you were talking about the white a second ago. But yes, there's pictures there, but there's one, there's a bunch of them in here, but there's one too. That's a guy from Michigan. Most of these guys are. But the point of this is we're going to talk about triggering bigger fish. We're going to talk about eliciting strikes from fish that are past bug eating to a certain extent. If most fish, it's somewhere between 18 and 23 inches, become pretty much meat eaters. And so that's what we're going to talk about. I put this picture in here to kind of make Mark realize when I was 11, I caught bigger fish than he did. Just kidding, just kidding. But anyway, yeah, there's a beauty. That was in Traverse City. So I want to go, I kind of condense this down because it's kind of hard to talk to a computer screen and not have to yell at people and say hi and all that. So we're going to go through some points and kind of paraphrase this presentation. But and so this is kind of a fail-safe thing. When I talk about fishing for big fish, that's kind of it's a falsehood in some respects, because none of this predicates you from catching little fish as well. And Mark can attest to that. And so, sorry, Mark, somebody's got to be the fall guy. But anyway, here we go. 4 ways to fail. Wrong spot is probably the number one thing we're going to go over. Wrong line, because it's about tools. Your line is an incredible tool. Wrong retrieve. The retrieve thing is one of the things I think is really done wrong more than anything. And lastly, which is strange, wrong fly, because being a fly designer for the most part of my life, you think that would be number one, but I truly think that's the last thing on this list. So what we're going to go over originally is just eliciting a strike, or understanding what makes these fish strike in the first place. And so it's easier for most people to understand this if they think of it as kind of the animal kingdom thing, because all predators are the same, and it doesn't matter what you're talking about, what animal, what fish, virtually all of them act the same. And so, and usually I would do this, and I always, in this program, I always say we don't talk politics. But I ask everybody what the most worthless animal in the world is. And so I'm going to let you think about it for a second, because usually it depends on what state I'm in. I will say, nobody say nobody say liberal Democrat, or nobody say right-wing psycho. It depends on what state I'm in, because then I tell them all, I says, soon as I ask you, I'll know the entire world's political persuasion here. So without asking anybody in the crowd, what's the most worthless animal in the world? Bingo, it's a house cat, not any of the political persuasions. And the reason I bring the house cat into this is because everybody on the planet, usually in the real shows, usually some lady gets ready to stand up and gives me an evil eye. And I don't hate cats, but cats are the ultimate worthless predator. They've been domesticated for thousands of years, and yet they can't lose that thing that makes them think they're a tiger and a killer. And the reason I bring this up is because everybody can figure this out. Everybody's taken a laser pointer and screwed with a cat. And they, how they chase and they do things. And the thing about the cat, you can learn everything you're going to know about a fish with this your neighbor's house cat, preferably walks around in the yard. And if you take a 7-weight, 7 weights are best probably, 7-weight with a mouse pattern, 12-pound tippet, and you go out and you watch your neighbor's house cat and you try to get him so he's not looking at you, and you take the fly and you slap that down as hard as you can. And that cat will do exactly what a trout will do. That cat, if you hit that fly down, bam, right beside him, he'll just turn immediately and look straight into that cat, into that mouse. If the mouse sits there and doesn't do anything, the cat will make it, right? If the cat makes it, he doesn't eat it. If you hit the fly down and run away from that cat, he's on it like a bum on a bologna sandwich. Boom, he's all over the thing, done. And it teaches you everything you need to know about trout. So it's pretty simple, but we're going to go, that's kind of the paraphrase version of how we're going to list the strike. We're going to get to that when we get into the retrieves. But like I said in the beginning, wrong spot. And this is where I'm going to just digress for a minute about history. I talked about how, or Mark said about, where I started out guiding in Michigan, and Pere Marquette, Manistee, Au all that stuff. And I started very young. I started actually when I was 15. I did my first trip, but so it was a long time. I was there for years. And so pretty much kind of the streamer thing, we started out back in the day, it was a minor on trout fishing, major on steelhead and salmon was how all of us got started back in the day. And so with that happening, I grew up actually with the Swisher and Richards era, and was mostly a dry fly and steelhead guy. And so most everything we did was for that. And that's why there was minors in trout, because there just wasn't the seasons. My dad was actually the first fly fishing guide on the Pere Marquette in 1940. And he told me basically the same thing. It was a July thing, big bugs, and that was pretty much it. And so how this came to be for me, just as a really quick overview, is I was watching a TV show, the guy fishing bass, and he said that he would elicit a strike out of the bass when they were set up and dour, meaning heat had pushed them deep, and then he would make them, he said, it was Larry Nixon, and he was walking the dog, which is a topwater bait, which goes across back and forth on the surface. And he said, it's a reactionary thing. We make them eat it. And so at that point, of course, he catches a fish, and it was July 9th. It was 84 degrees. And the day that I tied up a stick bait, went to the Boardman River and was trying to figure out, I just thought it looked cool, really, more than anything. And because I'm a guide, which means I know everything, or at least pretend to, and I've been fishing there my entire life, so I'm certain there's no fish over 20 inches because I've fished there and haven't caught one. And so I go to the river and I start doing this retrieve, trying to make this thing walk back and forth. And what happened, I was on the Boardman, like I said, where I've guided forever. And I knew every fish in the river, I was certain. And I knew there was no 20s. So I started at Garfield Road and I went downstream and I was walking the dog, but I couldn't do it because the current was pulling my fly one direction. And I get to the first corner there, Cold Creek Corner, and all sun, all bright, all every 2:30 in the afternoon. And I start walking that stick bait, well, it was a fly, but it was a giant woolly sculpin is what it was, across the surface. And I got my first truly huge, over 25-inch trout in the daytime. And I couldn't believe what happened. But I knew it had happened on purpose. So I went back home. First I sat down and considered becoming a professional drinker because I knew that it was an epiphany had just happened. I just hadn't figured it out. But then I also knew that I'd already won that championship. So I went home and I had actually dove for years and years for other things, watching smallmouth and other fish in the Great Lakes and diving, looking at bugs because of Gary LaFontaine's book. And I came back to the river and I dove that first 150 yards. And the first thing that happened to me, the true epiphany, was that I saw 3 fish closing 20 in that section. I was positive there were no fish that even close to that. Then I saw my fish. He was still in that run. Then I went about a quarter mile and saw another one, which was in the lower to mid 20s, something in there. And then I saw another one that I thought was close to 26 or 7. And this was all in less than a mile of river. And so now again, I sat down and tried to decide if the professional drinker was my job. And I kind of didn't really know, I knew something had changed. And so then I decided to stop all other forms of guiding, and I was gonna figure this out. And so I basically told all my customers that we were only gonna fish streamers. And then I subsequently dove a couple 100 hours. And what I would do, and that's what this whole thing is about coming up, is what I would do is I would dive a mile of river about right in that neighborhood. And then I would come back the next day and I would dive the same section of river. And I would just, log where I would see fish and where I wouldn't. And that's what the next 10 or so screens is all about. Because like I said, the whole thing about being a guide, you kind of get locked into things. And so this first slide where it says feeding lanes, holding water are totally different. Feeding lanes and holding water are totally different. And it's more about where you're not fishing than where you are. It's probably the most important thing in this whole program. Because I want you to ask yourself how many times you've been to specific water and how many times you've fished it from the one side or the other. Most people could almost leave a jet stream where they sit. Their feet are in the same spots and they do the same thing. And what you have to understand is that the holding water and the feeding water are different. And then you go back to that cat and realize that all fish, virtually every fish on the planet and everyone that's in cold water or warm water within 300 miles of you is a nocturnal feeder, including bluegills, perch, and everything else. Everybody knows walleye are, but so are everything else. And trout are extreme night eaters, but we aren't usually fishing then. So when you figure this out, when you see this thing right here, feeding lanes, figure out when they're feeding 6 to 18 inches of peated cobblestone gravel. What that is a nighttime feeding zone for adults. It's a juvenile area. You'll find your small fish feeding in these areas that are at 6 to 18 inches with peated cobblestone gravel. And there's a reason. High light penetration equates to high bug life. High bug life equates to everything. It equates to it's the circle of life. It's the basic little fish follow in there to get the bugs, the medium fish. And the key to this is that when we get into this migration, is that the big fish move extreme distances to get to their feeding grounds. And that was the thing in my diving that really got pushed into my brain, because the feeding grounds everything we've been taught in our life is right where you see this guy standing. He's in one of the little, and they used to tell us that the biggest fish would take up the primary feeding zones, which is cute for fish up to 18 inches or 20, but real fish aren't even in these zones. They come here at night to feed, and they move extreme distances. The thing about the small fish is they do not migrate at night. You have to get to a certain size before they do that. So what the fish are doing is they're going to these zones at night. And if you fish at night, you try to find kind of marginal water, tails of these things at the bottom end of these where the fish can congregate, but they don't move. The big fish come to them, and they come to eat the neighbor's kids. They're basically just coming in here to feed, their predation. They're looking for other trout or any other fish that's in these shallow gravel type waters or the tailouts of these waters. So the first thing, now we're getting into this thing because we're not usually fishing during the feeding times for these giant fish. And again, giant fish, it could be 8, 16, 18, depends on your river. 18, you get on the White River, real fish isn't really, those fish have so much food, but 18 to 22 would probably be like the Bighorn River or something that's super rich in food. They may not hit that meat eater until they're 22 or 4 inches. But at that point, they are almost specifically eating, fish. They're eating meat, crayfish, trout, sculpin, whatever they can. But we're generally not fishing in these feeding times. And so we've got to figure it out. And this is the slide when you read this, and this is where things get really different. Because in my diving, what I found was the first thing I found is everything I had been taught about trout was not true. I never found a really big fish in a log jam. I was taught since I was 5 years old, I started fishing at a very young age, the old mossy back lives under that log jam. Yeah, your grandpa caught him in 06, right? Be an old fish. But at any rate, I do these dives and I would look. And the thing that I found that was the most slap in the face, if you would, was the lack of structure that a fish need to hang in. And where I would see them, I never saw in 200 and some hours of diving, I never saw a fish in the same spot twice. And again, I would dive a section, come back and do it again the next day if I could. And so the thing that tells you, and I would always go to where I thought they should be. And the thing that I found that was the most interesting is exactly what says up there. Daytime, when we're fishing, the areas where these fish are 18 to 36 inches deep, almost always a soft substrate with a parallel color change. And again, I was in Michigan doing this. So a lot of sand, a lot of, not hard bottom like out here, but generally, and I would say almost without exception, long insides without a lot of curve to them, didn't matter, but long insides and seldom near structure, which tells you, and remember, this is a daytime thing, not a nighttime thing. And so what that tells you generally is that, and especially in the Midwest, you can see these zones. You can see these, like in this slide on the left side of that, you can see that light and dark mix. It doesn't have to be a substrate where it's soft. It can be a ledge. It can be anything that makes a parallel color change. But almost every fish I saw, big fish, was basically where you walk to fish. And so if you can get one thing through, and if you're going to try something to target these, maybe the first thing you do is figure out if you're standing in the fish, because that's probably the most common thing you've got. But looking at this slide, kind of a little bit Midwestern, it's obviously not, but the bottom is a little bit more like it would be back home. The big thing you need to understand is that a big fish will not rest in water that pushes it. If you look at this picture, it's got multiple parallel color change, one on the inside, one on the outside. The one on the outside is a depth thing from the weed beds. The The one on the inside is a substrate change. It's got green moss with sand beside it. That is probably the best holding spot you will ever see in your life, right there. That inside corner with that parallel color change that's 5 feet from the bank, absolute money. But remember, if you stand in that water and it pushes you back and forth in any way, you probably aren't where the fish are. They will not buck current like that. They don't like to push it. So,
Kelly, question.
go ahead.
Could I interrupt for 1 second?
Please do.
When you are targeting those types of areas, and if you're going to get into this in a minute, then but just consider a duly noted question. How deep are you fishing? What are you looking for? I mean, if you're looking from 3 feet to like a little more than 1.5 feet, where do you want your fly to be? I mean, will these fish come up for that, or do you need to hit them in the nose?
Good question. I mean, 18 to 36 is generally your holding depths. And by the way, I never saw, it's one of the big, I am going to get to this in a minute with lines and stuff, but I never saw a fish in water deeper than 4 or 5 feet. And if I did, I dove the Big Manistee a ton, and below Houghton Pile and some of those big water areas, a lot of 8-10 foot holes. I never once saw a big fish in one, ever. If I did in a big hole, it was usually edged out or way at the tail out and usually on the edge. And again, 3 foot of water, but the fish will react. And I'll get to that in a second on retrieval stuff, but they definitely will react. The biggest thing is that it's hard to fish them when you're standing on them. So and I'll get to this retrieve thing in a second on that, but and this kind of, let me get to that in a second. Was it Mark I was talking? I don't know who I'm talking to.
No problem.
Okay, I'll get to it in a second, but no, you don't have to hit them in the head. And so on this, I want you to see this slide and think about it, because the red stripes in this slide are supposed to indicate jet streams from boats. If a boat left a mark in the water, that is exactly what you would see. And then you see they all go the same thing, and they all huck it into that deep water. And then you see the yellow line. The yellow line is where I go to pee and get out, and ironically where everybody picnics. But when I see people, if you look at that yellow line, when I see people fishing, they wade out to about where that red and yellow meet, and they cast out into the deep. Where that red and yellow line meets is about 2.5 to 3 foot of water. It's where it gets a little bit, they're just there and they start casting out into the big water. And what the key of that is that where they stand is exactly where the fish are. This is the Big Hole River. My 3 biggest fish on that river came off of this bend on the inside. And like I said, other than peeing or eating picnic lunches over there, I have never seen somebody walk that inside. It's 300 yards long, and it's less than 3 foot every inch of it. And so this is one that's a little closer to home. This is the Sable. It's called the Eagle. And this is the below Mayo. This stretch right here, everything in your fishing psyche is screaming to you. I bet you half of you fished it. It's everything in your psyche is telling you exactly what the guy in the boat's looking at. He's looking off to the right side there, right? And he's just beating it and beating it. Over on the left side, that point, I ate lunch on that virtually 50 days a year for 11 years, right? Previous to writing the book. And so everything, but you can see in that slide, it's kind of hard, it's small, but you can see a yellow line 30 feet from shore. It's a compressed photo, so you're looking at 100 yards of water right there, but 30 feet from that yellow point on the left is where everybody on earth wades to fish. And every single boat fishes this right side, which is 5 foot deep, overhangs. It's got everything that you think you should see for big fish. Now, I dove that section, I think, a half a dozen times. I guided that until I left, probably more than anyone. I would run this section 40 to 50 times a season. And that section, I never caught a fish over 22 in my life on that outside bend. And if you look at this, that yellow stripe on the left, and there's that bottom button or ball, that little call out thing. I went there one time and there's a guy wading through it. And I asked him, I knew the guy, I asked him if I was diving. Jerry Dennis was running the boat and he's coming behind me. And I asked him if it was okay to dive through there. He said, no problem, I've already fished it. And he was standing right on that yellow line. And right about at the point of that island, he was up above. And I asked him, I said, I got 60 feet below him and started swimming again. And I get right, as you know, like in the PM or any of those rivers back home, you can make a step and the track will stay there. And you can see it, right? You can see their footsteps going through the detritus, the bark and all that stuff. And I get there and I look out right in his footstep. Literally, it's got a little vortex going around in the footstep from the current swirling. And there's a 27-inch brown laying there in his footstep. And I back off and I'm like, oh my God. But I never told anybody. The running joke is I said I wouldn't even tell Jesus because he just turned me to a pillar of salt because I would have lied where the fish was anyway. I told no one and I backed off and I said, Dean, did you just go through here? Yeah, I'm all done. Don't worry about it. And I said, got it. And the very next day, the first time in my life, instead of fishing that outside, we roll through there and Herm Thomas pops a 25 off of that run. So that, and I'd never in 11 years had ever caught a fish off this outside bend over 22. I got 122 at the very top of it, kind of before it turns into what you're seeing. And so, and then we caught 6 fish over 2 foot off that inside right there in the same season. And so it tells you that probably a lot of why you don't see the bigger fish is probably you're in the wrong spot. Does that make sense? And it's okay. So it's not always, you can't and it doesn't have, this is the Madison, this is just above my lodge. And so, and the second part of this, you have to hunt your water, not hope it. That's kind of my mantra, hunt more, hope less. And so when you're looking for these things, a lot of times they're just soft water. They're just water that's not getting pushed. And most of my big fish in the upper have come out of that 50 yards of water you're looking at right there. And it's just a perfect holding zone, but you have to look and make sure it doesn't push you around. Walk in it and look in it and then approach it a little different, but don't go to the same spot you have been always. So basically, if you don't get anything out of the rest of this, remember that you're looking for soft insides. Parallel color changes are the best. They're absolutely the most important thing you'll see. It's a break in the bottom, and it can be anything. Depth, same bottom, but different depths that leave you a kind of a line that's visual. Generally under 3 foot, you stand in it, and it doesn't push you around. It doesn't wiggle you back and forth. And then you found the spot. So now moving through the water, just get through it. Don't sit and just beat the water. Don't fish with an urgency. Just find players. Eliminate that crap water. Go to water. Try water you haven't fished. And I think that's so important because, I watch guys here guiding in Michigan, everywhere I've ever guided, and it's almost like their boats are on autopilot. And if you fish with them waiting, they put in at the same bridge, they walk the same bend, they walk the same inside, they're comfortable, they're not going to fall in the water, but they don't change things. And remember, not every fish is going to, I don't care if you're throwing a fistful of night crawlers, not every fish eats, mostly because we're fishing when these fish are not programmed to eat. Big fish are not supposed to eat in the daytime. You have to make it happen. So don't stand there and hope that something's going to happen. They're going to make you after a while. So are we good with that for a minute before we move? Because we're going to come circle around to this at the lines in a second. Any suspect questions? Maybe Kelly's full.
Do you fish much at night?
Oh, that's all I did in Michigan. That's how I made my career.
Okay.
But I hardly ever do out here. The shit that eats you out here. But that's not why. Just fishing's good in the daytime. But I fished a ton at night. Probably 50% of my career was made during hex hats And so, again, it's totally different. You're looking for that water that's kind of marginal below those feeding zones, because the trout, and I didn't really mention this to you, besides me looking and diving, there's another study done that showed fish moving, and it was done on the Au Sable, and the average fish movement was 1,000 meters a day. And contrasting that to some of the old articles and kind of myths of the 60s and 70s that a brown trout would live its entire life in a 50-foot circle. There was one fish they showed in 3 separate rivers, the North Branch, the South Branch, and the main branch of the Au Sable, which means, and that happened in 6 weeks, which means a collective movement of over 60 miles.
Wow.
Some of those fish would move a mile. There was 8 fish that were radio telemetry, and they would move upwards of a mile a night. And this is important also. They move exclusively upstream to feeding zones, and they move approximately an hour pre and post dusk and dawn. And so you have these big movement times where they go to feed, but they don't have to go that far. I mean, it's indicative of how much food source is in their zone. So if they've got a plethora of stuff to eat, there's no reason for them to move, right? But once they've exhausted that, or for whatever reason they move, they go upstream to find these zones, and they go downstream in the morning. And that's when they'll swim downstream looking for a place to hold. And if you fish trichos, excuse me, if you fish trichos much, if you go out when you should, like, and it's a 5:30, you know, when the females start hatching, you know, the female tricho hatches sexually mature, the males hatch the night before. And so you'll get these spinner falls very early in the morning, 5:30, 6. In Michigan, the Boardman River, for example, you couldn't find a tricho after 7 o'clock. It was always done before that. And those zones where you'd go in that marginal water, which are usually cressy, you know, they're aquatic, they live in vegetation. And you'd see these huge brown trout coming through these zones. And I always thought in the day that there was something wrong with them. I just thought, what the hell's he doing? You know, why is he out here? Of course, you throw your stupid little tricho at him like he might come up and eat it. And they were just going down to find a holding zone, something that was comfortable for that fish. So it was, and the night thing, you know, it's a wholly different world, you know, because generally you're mousing or big wet fly swinging stuff. But yes, I did a ton of it. And so, but a whole different targeting method too. But we'll get to that later. So anything else? No other question?
Good at this point.
Good at this point. Okay, so wrong tool for the job. That was what I was talking about with the lines here. And I'm not even though I designed most of these lines, I'm not trying to sell you on a line. I want you to understand that when you ask me, do you hit them on the head? Really, you don't have to, because the fish generally is going to sit between 4 and 6 inches off the bottom. And so if you're in 3 foot and 6 inches off the bottom and your fly's a foot deep, you're talking between, you know, if he's migrating, however, you know, whatever deep he is, 12 to 18 inches of impact zone. And when you understand that a brown trout can go 0 to 34 and half his body length, that's imperceivable to the naked eye. And so what the lines do is they allow you to fish that fly in that zone and not, and I'm going to cover this in a second, but it's more about, it has multiple functions. The first thing in there is about it carries your fly easier. It's very hard to throw a big fly on a floating line. And repetitively. We'll get to this in a second about how often we cast, but it's more about carrying that fly and not wearing you out, right? It just turns it over easy. They're not heavy. These lines are tungsten nowadays. They're pretty thin, and they keep the fly in the right depth. And I'll overemphasize this right now. We do not fish deep. Even on the white, we don't, when that river is 10 feet off its bank, maybe has a 17 or 18 foot vertical rise, we are still fishing for the most part in the upper 20 inches of water, because the fish well, even if it's huge, are going to move over edged out, and they're not going to fight that big current. And so this, the sinking lines, and don't think of them, and we're going to get to this in the retrieve thing in a second, but I never swing flies. And so I'm going to get to that. But so that people think about these lines as their grandfather's lines that were big and heavy and clunky and hard. They're not that, the overall line is 200 grains. And so it's not that heavy, but and they're really easy to cast when you learn to do it, because you feel it all. And you just slow down a little bit, and man, you can just make pinpoint casts with it. So it's really easy. And I'm not going to go through much of this, and you can look this up. I've got the stuff online too, and they're all over the place. But just on the leader thing, this is kind of critical, especially for your day fishing, is that the leader be short enough that you don't have a fly that is above your line. So the shorter that is, and I personally think you could tie your fly to your fly line. I don't think they give a care about this, right? They are not looking at the damn leader. You're not talking about something floating. It's ripping through the water. And so the short leader keeps that fly closer to your line. And again, we're not trying to get really deep. We're just trying to keep the fly in the strike zone. And so my basic formula is 12 inches of 20-pound butt section, and I use Maxima Green. And I get probably one of the most common questions I get is if I use fluorocarbon. But fluorocarbon does not sink at the rate you think it does. Fluorocarbon sink rates are far more important on dry flies, for technical dries, because it'll break the meniscus and basically make that line invisible once it goes through the surface. If it's on the surface, it's no more invisible than monofilament. Has to break the meniscus to get underneath there. And the other time it's important is on spin fishing, because you throw far enough that the line not floating doesn't detract from your lure going down. But for what we do, our retrieves are so short, so fast, it's not relevant. I mean, if you like it, it's fine. I mean, I'm just comfortable with Maxima Green because I've been using it since, '06. And so, I mean, I grew up with this stuff. I'm comfortable with it. And that's important, that you know that your comfort zone, that how many times you can hit a tree or a branch or a rock, or, stretch your knot before you should change it. It's just a comfort zone. And so 12 inches of 20-pound butt, 18 to 2 foot of tippet. That's always 12-pound. I seldom, even on smaller flies, go below. The only time I'll go below 12 pounds is if the fly is small enough that I think it's hovering the fly wrong. If it's impeding the fly's ability to swim. And then I might go down to 8 or 10 pound, but that's really, really rare. And the only exception of this is if I'm fishing moss beds, I will run 3 foot of tippet, just so the fly hovers above them. And I'll get to that in a second, but and actually I won't. I took this, I shortened it. And I want to go backwards in time for a second because I missed this. My favorite water, I told you about the water that I like to see with the parallel color change. And because I talked too much and I shortened this program a little bit, my favorite big fish holding zones are what most people call frog water. When you see water that goes off of a tail out and gets kind of gooey, not a lot of, nothing in it. Generally there's weed beds in it. And the best water for giant fish is if you can find weed beds there, we call them a checkerboard, where you've got there's some tons of them on the White River. I mean, tons. And it's where you've got a weed bed that could be anywhere from 6 to 20 feet long. And then you've got another one, but there's a stripe between them somehow. Usually it's sand. And if you can get that broken checkerboard, it is absolutely, and there's one stretch below on the McMaster's to Parmalee stretch where I've fished for 20 years and never seen an angler stop or even slow down in it. And everybody says the same thing, it's frog water. It is the premium, best holding water for fish over 25 inches in the world. And when I get in those zones, because it's generally not very current, not very currenty, it's not pushy, I'll lengthen my leaders to 3 foot of tippet. So my overall leader might be 4 foot long. And I'll take flies that don't sink at all, like a zoo cougar, or a heifer groomer, or something like that, or a bangtail. and I will hover my line basically through the weed beds and let that fly zip just above it. Is that clear? Make sense?
Yeah.
Sorry, I missed that on going through the water. But so anyway, moving right along, rod wise, just because I get asked this in the normal seminars right away. I like 9'6" weights. For rod, doesn't really matter. Obviously I had St. Croix, I did my rods with them for a long time, and they quit making high-end rods, and I switched it over to Echo. It's just an old photo that I had. But I don't think it's relative, but I do like to cover a little bit about what I like to see in them. I don't like stiff rods. The rod's got to have a fast butt and a fast tip, but I want the rod to open in the middle, which frequently is hard to tell because when you flex the rods, it's hard to make the middle of the rod flex. But you don't want a rod that's strictly stiff, because if it's stiff, it'll compress your loop. And if it doesn't open in the middle, it'll be a problem child. It's hard to cast rods that are really stiff. So I like a fast butt on it and a fast tip, and the butt fights the fish, tip animates the fly, which we're going to talk about in a second. And I don't like fighting butts on my rods. So they just get in the way of how much we cast. Cool. And that's just kind of a thing. So here's the guts of what we're going to talk about. And this is back to what you asked me earlier, Mark, about hitting them in the head. By the way, I've got my tea here. It's a physical impossibility for me to lose my voice, which you probably already figured out. But I do crack occasionally once I get talking like this. So, okay, sinking line techniques. This is, this is kind of probably the biggest thing that we changed when the books were coming out and things, is that how we retrieve the flies. And the jerk strip, which is still the number one, and it's what I wish people would truly do more than anything, as the line below it says, it's not a retrieve, it's a way of life. When you learn to jerk strip, you can do virtually anything. You can do your dry flies better. And I want you to understand that stripping your line is a single with your left hand, if you're right-hander, pulling the rope or, just stripping is a single way of fishing. It is a one pony, it's a trick pony, but it's a one pony deal only. And you cannot fish flies slowly by just pulling on your line. If you will learn to jerk strip, and everybody says, wow, Kelly, you're so lucky you got a retrieve named after you. Truly, I named it after Larry Nixon working a jerk bait. And I'm afraid this video is not going to work when we get to it, but I'm going to, if it doesn't, then I'm going to, I don't know why it's not, but if it doesn't, I'll walk you through it. But understanding that when we do this, the jerk strip, and the difference is when most people throw their fly out, they simply pull the line. They pull it and they pull it, and that is a one-trick pony. It goes one speed, and if you don't understand this, you need to get in the water and watch it. And the most important thing you can do with all streamer fishing is watch your fly. Understand, I'm going to get to that in a minute, but understand what it's doing. Don't just pull that rope, just pull it and pull it and pull it. And then try to fish a fly slow with a real slow retrieve once, and watch what happens. Nothing. The damn fly just sinks in the water. You can't impart small movements like that. Even if you tried to do really short little pulls, you would find it so troublesome, it's ridiculous in line control. And so when you get to this, everything is line control. And this is the nuances of streamer fishing. So I already mentioned this thing about you don't fish deep. 18 inches would be pretty much as far as you will fish a fly on an active retrieve. We're going to get to other retrieves in a second, but on an active retrieve, it's very seldom to fish deeper or more than 18 inches. And you have to understand the thought process of throwing the line out and retrieving it quickly. It's very hard to go deeper than that and still hunt specific styles of water. So you slap the fly down, bam, that's what I was talking about, the neighbor's house cat. You hit that fly down and you get that fish's attention. And this is a super critical point to streamer fishing. Everybody talks about the flies, The fly is important, the color is really important, but the impact that fly makes is the absolute most important thing of your entire retrieve. That fly hitting the water is going to create a Hertz wavelength in the water. There's been all kinds of studies done on this in ocean fish, Great Lakes fish, very little on trout and rivers, but there was one I found. A Hertz wavelength creates between a 15 and 23 wavelength is a distressed wavelength. That impact of the fly hitting the top of the water can resonate for up to 100 yards upstream. 300 yards downstream is what the only study I can find with trout. And if you've ever fished spinners, you would understand this. If you've ever fished a big MEP spinner, you slow roll a blade and it creates that thumb, that thing that creates the fish to come around and look. And so they're checking on a distressed wavelength. That's when that's your first stimulus for the fish to be triggered when you're doing this eliciting a strike thing. When it goes, bam, hits the water, that fish is on full alert because it doesn't know what it is. And then when you said hitting the fly in the head or the fish on the head, that fish might come from 30 feet, might come from 6 feet. If you're reading your water properly and you're hunting the water, not hoping it, and you go in and you target the fish where you think it should be, that fly hits down, I can guarantee you a 12-foot radius of that impact has every fish in that river already on alert. They know it's there and they are not afraid of you. They are not, this is not a dry fly and throwing a reflective leader over the fish's head and scaring it off. This fish is on full alert. So the fly hits down and it hits hard and immediately, and this is so important because you leave so many fish on the table if you don't do this. You hit that fly down and you move that fly immediately. That fish, if he thinks it's a triggered response, if he thinks it's something he's going to eat, he will be within that 12 foot in a half a second. He will be on your fly somewhere if you watch. And he may or may not eat it. That's not a guarantee, obviously. But you will have triggered it if that fly, and I said this about the cat and the mouse early on for a reason. If you hit the fly down and it lays on the surface and doesn't do shit, you just lost your chance. If the fly hits, just like with the cat, the fly hits, if he looks at it, nothing happens, he's just staring at it. Same thing with the trout. He makes it. If the fly hits the surface, you take off running, you've just doubled your opportunity to make things happen. I like the fly. If you're going to fish a little bit deeper, if you want to get a little deeper, hit the fly on the surface, run it to 1.5 feet or so, and then you can relax a little bit and let the fly dive. But make that first thing count, perpendicular to the flow. This is the thing that changed most everything about streamer fishing. Before the book, virtually every angler on earth swung their flies. I never, ever swing a fly tail first into a fish. It's like a gazelle backing his ass into a lion's mouth. It just doesn't happen. Fish don't move downstream any distance with its hind end just hanging out there. They turn around, but that would be a completely passive response. And now when you do that with that passive response, not that we haven't all caught fish doing it, but if you think about it from a natural perspective, from nature's perspective, if you're slapping a fly down and it's going to take off running, why would it suddenly just go passively downstream tail first? And what would the impetus for a fish that is not really programmed to eat in a day? They just don't do it. Most of the big fish that I saw when I was diving had little fish hanging around them. I mean, a lot of fish sometimes, maybe 6, 8, 10, 12-inch trout. There'd be other fish around, but they weren't there. It's just like a lion in the Serengeti. They do not feed in the daytime. So we're trying to trigger this. So we're going to go perpendicular to the flow. You're going to hit the fly close to shore and you're going to hit it down hard. And then now you're going to come straight across stream or you're going to cast slightly upstream so the head is coming down, quartering to the fish. Good with that? It's completely different than ever tail first fishing. And so we're going to keep the rod low. If the video shows, you'll see what I'm talking about. But you always keep the rod low. If you watch my videos, you'll hear my rod tip actually touching the water, right? And it's always low and downstream. You never, ever mend your line. You encourage a bow in your line, because if your line is tight, if there's water pressure against it, and then you move your rod tip, and that's what moves the fly. That is the jerk strip. In a jerk strip, you get a tight line and you pull the rod, strip the excess out. Pull the rod, strip the excess. And I said it earlier, watch your fly. You have to see this fly. You have to see it moving. And you have to know that you're the one moving it. You can't just guess. You got to watch the thing and see it move. And I write in here 6 to 12 inch movements. When you pull the rod, you go 6 inches, strip the excess. You never have a tight line. You don't strip against your finger. You never get a groove in your hand. Your line is tight under your finger. You pull the rod, strip the excess. Pull the rod, strip the excess. 6 to 12 inches is a cute start. When you're really good at this, you should be able to do 3 movements per foot, or 4 3-inch movements, or 3 4-inch movements, but you should be able to make your fly with your rod tip, because the line's tight to your rod. You should be able to quiver that fly. You should be able to make it do anything you want, but you cannot do that by pulling the string. You can't pull your excess and do little tiny movements. With a rod, you can do it 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. You can do anything you want when you learn to manipulate the fly with your rod tip and not your stripping hand. I asked one of the most famous bass fishermen in the world, named Shaw Grigsby. Shaw and I were doing a seminar together one day, and I asked him, if you look at bass fishing, for any of you that don't know anything about bass fishing, they're the best anglers in the world. I mean, these guys have been doing things we're just thinking about today for 30, 40 years, and they fish for millions of dollars. And it starts with millions of anglers. And the top 50 have to ascend to the top, and everybody gets to the top. They all have to go through the same qualifiers. The top 15 anglers out of 50 are always the same 10 of 15. It's always that group. And I asked Shaw, and realized these guys are fishing for millions in sponsorships and millions of dollars, really. And so I asked him once, and he's one of them in his 60s, still competing at a high level. And I said, Shaw, what's the difference between the top 10 and everybody else? Without blinking, I mean, a second passed. And he said, it's their ability to move their lure with their rod and not their reel. Now, if you think about that, that's what I'm telling you. Your ability to move your fly with your rod tip, because you are the reel, your left hand is stripping is the reel. If you can move that fly with your rod tip and animate your fly, you will be, and as soon as you can do it, you'll be a 50% more successful angler. I mean, instantly. And I've watched hundreds and hundreds of kids I've taught, all my guides and clients. And the second you can move that fly with your rod, not your stripping hand, you are a better angler. It's just that simple. And so we're going to cover every 3 foot of what, if you're on foot, and this is where we're going to hunt the fly, not hope it. You're going to cover every 3 foot from as close as you can on wherever you cast. So if you're from a boat, it gets harder. You know, you got to be going pretty slow. So hopefully there's 2 of you. One person hits one piece, the next person hits the next. But if you run with a thought process to hit every 3 foot, and you buy into the Hertz wavelength thing, you're going to pretty much cover this water. You will not leave anything on the table that is going to respond. And I want you to, the next time, just to drive this point home on the how fast those fish can get here. If you get a little fish, especially if you're in a high concentration area like the white, or parts of the manistee, the SF, if you've got a little rainbow on, if you were nymph, especially if you snag them, if you snag a little rainbow or brown trout, and he's doing that super 8-10 inch fish, and he's doing that super wiggle thing, or even if you've got them in the mouth, they just they just wiggle more, and everybody looks at their fish. I want you to stop and look in about a 10-foot circle around your fish. Don't look at the rainbow or the brown. Don't even look. If you pay attention, you will be amazed how often you see a big fish in the peripheral zone of that fish. Whether they eat it or not, you don't know. But if you pay attention, It happens to me here on this river, maybe 6, 7 times a season. And you'll just see this. And a lot of times they eat it. A lot of times they eat the fish, but just pay attention. Bottom line to this thing, lots of small movements is better than one. And that's the problem with just stripping the line. So if you do nothing else, if you learn nothing, just go out and try to move your fly in short movements with your rod tip and not your hand. Now, I don't think this is going to show. Hold on. This is the one that I can't get to go for some reason.
Hold on. Kyle, can you help us? Kyle Hazelwood? Are you here?
I don't know. Come on.
Here.
I don't know why it will not.
Can you help him get this synced up?
So what's the symptom? It just doesn't run?
Just won't, it won't auto start. It's keyed to my program, but when I get into Zoom, it won't, the screen won't share, or the video won't run. And I mean, it's all embedded, everything's, I mean, if I take this off of Zoom, it runs like a champ. But on here, for whatever reason, I can't get the video to move.
Can we watch it unzoomed, Kelly, just to see it?
On Zoom?
No, don't. Oh, you mean on the Zoom program?
When it's on the Zoom, if I take out, when I shut this off of Zoom, the thing's gonna work like a champ.
Kelly, are you able to share your desktop instead of the PowerPoint program?
I didn't, excuse me?
Can you share your desktop instead of your individual program?
I might be able to.
It might work that way.
Can I stop share or?
Yeah, go ahead.
It might take us a second.
No problem.
I don't know. Hey, come back here. Didn't seem to matter. Let's try, boy, as soon as I go to PowerPoint, I don't know, maybe if I just do it here. Here, bingo. Can you see it? Are you see?
No, we don't see it.
All right, well.
See you, Kelly.
Well, how interesting. I don't know, but there's 3 of them, so this is a drag. I don't know.
How about we move on and I'll do a little research while you're.
We can always come back to it. So now I got to get back to this. Share screen. So anyway, before I screwed this up, I have no idea why it's. Let's get back here. Where's this?
We'll start like that.
Got to get to the slideshow where we were. All right. So what I'm showing is right now, the rod tip's pointing at the fly. I am simply going to pull my rod to the left. And when it does that, and then I'm going to retrieve the rod's going to get pointed back at the fly, and I'm going to strip the excess. Hold on 1 second. Sorry about that. The problems with living alone and barking animals. So I'm going to simply point the rod at the fly, strip the rod or strip the excess, then I pull against a tight line and go. And this is just a faster version of, it's slow motion and fast motion. So if we don't find it, anybody that wants, I'll send you that clip. You can email me. I mean, I've got lots of videos about it, but basically you are simply pointing the rod at the fly, and you've got the current is against the, you let the current push your line, and then you just pull the rod. And you can do it slow, you can do it fast. You pull the rod. When you're done doing that, maybe 2 or 3 pulls, you strip the excess and point the rod tip back at the line, or at the fly, excuse me. Does that make sense? It's really, if you watch the fly, it really is imperative that you do, because you'll see every time you hit that rod, 3-4 inch, you move your rod tip as far as you want the fly to move. And you get used to going pop, pop, pow, strip the excess, pop, pop, pow, strip the excess. And you make the fly go in erratic movements. And that's the most important thing, that you learn to make the fly swim cross current and allow that line. So as soon as you hit the fly down, the current's already pushing against your line. Put your rod low, downstream, and then you pull upstream against your line. And that fly will come straight across the river at you. You never pop the rod in the air. You always keep it very low to the water. So the next thing, does that make sense? Any questions on that? Negative? All right. So next thing's about vertical. And again, these aren't going to show vertical jig and dying drift. And I'll have to talk us through this one too, I'm sure, because I've yet to, I can't get it to go. I don't know why. But you can see my rod is down, right? And so on a vertical, and this is a slow moving thing, and it has to do with, especially in early and late season, when you want to run crayfish and things that you want to go up and down in the current. And so not everything is a fast reactionary bite. Everything doesn't have to be ripping a fly across the river and just trying to get a reactionary bite. There are frequently times when you need to slow your fly down. And particularly on the White River, when everybody's ripping the shit out of that thing and going cross current with 8-inch flies, and no one's going to the feeding zones, that soft water, and jigging. And it is an incredible, I have been a taxidermist for 42 years. I've mounted somewhere in the 3,000 to 4,000 big fish zone, and I have autopsied everyone. It's not an autopsy, it's a post-mortem observation. It's not a human. And so I have found everything you can imagine: baby turtles, squirrels, muskrats. My favorite thing was a red-winged blackbird wing, just the wing. And I like to think that he jumped up and tore it right off that bird, but I don't know. Probably somebody hit it with a lawnmower and threw it in there. But anything you can imagine, right? The most consistent thing that I find in fish, because they digest so slowly, are crayfish. And I have almost every single predatory size brown that was a river-based fish had pieces of crayfish, if not multiples, in its stomach. And so it tells you that it's not all about speed. And so if you can learn the vertical jig, and all it is if you look at my rod in that picture, I'm going to lift the rod up and I'm going to do it in steps. I'm going to pick up, 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 and then I'm going to slowly let the fly sink down and drop that rod tip. And I'm going to strip all that excess. I'm going to take the rod tip right to the water, and then I'm going to do it all over again. And I just keep, and all you're trying to do, and it's just killing me, I can't get this video, but I have no idea what this is doing, but it's not going to let me do it. You just pick the rod up slowly, and then you drop the rod and you strip the excess at the same time, but you try not to impede the drop of the fly. So it's up, down, up, down. And you do this you can do it with any fly you want. It doesn't matter what you're fishing. You can do it with a bait fish. You can do it with anything you want, but it's imperative that the head of the fly has some sort of weight in it. Just enough. And if you want to do a dying drift, where there's 2 of them in here, you can use flies that are like flies that would be kind of hovery, like a zoo cougar or something like that. And you do it kind of long pulls where it barely goes up and down, where the fly doesn't drop head first. It just kind of hovers, but it gives you another retrieve. So you're not locked into just pulling the rope, just jerk stripping. You're going to just go in and you're going to hit these things, and you're going to give, especially in heavy concentrated water where there's a lot of people, colder water. If you fish October in the white, a couple weeks ago, the white was, a month ago, the white dropped to 54 degrees in a day. Or excuse me, 47 degrees from 54 in a day. That shocks fish. When you do a 5-degree move, because that river's so consistently the same temperature, the only possible chance you've got is to do a slow motion fly, crayfish or something like that. And so that's what you're going for. That was just me showing the same thing. And this isn't going to show because it's the bug that it was showing a weighted head fly. That's all that was. Any questions on that jerk, on this this stuff, the vertical. And I apologize, I have no idea. And I can send anyone that wants to see this videos, I'll send them to you. They're in a bunch of my videos, but I could just send them direct if you want. So, and this is showing me do that and losing a fish, just so people can laugh at me.
Now, when you do the crayfish thing, Kelly, what kind of line are you?
I'm still using a sinking line most of the time. You can use a floater as long as the fly is heavy enough to drop. It's a little bit, it's a better actual vertical drop, but there's a lot can go wrong. And with a sinking line, you don't get quite as much radical vertical drop, but you can feel more and you can see. It's a little harder to see, but a lot of times when you lift your rod up, and that's when you would feel anything, but you seldom get a fish to eat on the lift. It's almost always on the drop. So if you're using a floating line, you'd be looking at your leader, which is really tough to see. Because what you will see is if you don't see the actual mouth of the fish open, which is really common, you'll see, because they aren't racing for the fly. You're jigging it and you'll see a white flash underwater. That's telling you better have struck right now. Or you'll see your fly line, which is easier to see than mono if you're using a long leader. If you're using a floating line, you're usually running 10-foot leaders. And so you're picking it up, and it's hard to see that in the water move. And you'll just see a little tiny movement to your line, which tells you it's called a push eat, where they ate it on the drop. So you wouldn't know that it happened. You'll just see your line move.
And you're fishing typically a shorter leader than with a streamer. Or
Yeah,
a longer.
longer on a floating, short, and on when I'm doing the sinking line, I don't change my leaders.
Okay.
They're still overall about 3 feet. But it's all you're doing is lifting that rod up and down. Even if you're floating down the river in the boat, it's really you get a lot of coverage out of this, and you can, water's off color, whatever it is, whatever thing, they're just not reactionary biting. And what you see most anglers do, if they're not doing, especially people that have one trick where all they can do is pull the line, right? All they can do is strip that line. They can strip it really fast or pretty fast, but the fly doesn't really change. And so, and if you think about the way, especially when I'm down there during that January and February, it's nothing for me to see 60 boats a day. I mean, that's when it's really busy, right? And so everybody seems to do the exact same thing. They throw to the shore. They don't look for weed beds. They don't look for cuts. They beat the shit out of the bank, and they don't have anything else. And when it's time, when they're not catching anything, they haven't tried anything, out comes that plethora of excuses, the Band-Aids on their ego. No one's done a damn thing to change the results. They'll change the fly, but that's all they've got. And it's really sad because you're leaving probably half your fish on the table.
I get the impression listening to you talk about this as you fish, that it's not necessary. This is not a He-Man approach. You're not
make
out
it one.
there, how hard can I throw it? How far can I throw it? How fast can I strip it in? So there's more technique here. Well,
I'd say at least 90% more, because that is the Neanderthal portion of it. And I've done that too, and do it. If I've got a massive reactionary bite going, that's great. But if there isn't a massive reactionary bite and every fish in the ditch isn't committing suicide, now what are you going to do?
Right.
If all you can do is one thing, it's no different than if all you can do is do a upstream dead drift dry fly, you're leaving 50% of your fish on the table. If you can't skitter a caddis, you can't fish it. If you don't twitch your hoppers, you're just sitting there. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of tech, and in streamer fishing, because it's so much, you are asking a fish to do something it's not programmed to do. You go fish juvenile fish with your dry flies, they're sticking their damn head out of the water. How hard's that? You get to see it. And so now you've got multiple, very few variables. When you can't see the fish and you've got to read water because you have to understand where your fish are, now you've got to have multiple retrieves. And so, and I really like people to have at least 2. I mean, if nothing else, everybody can pull the line. Everybody on earth can go out and pull the damn line and pull it back. But can you move your fly in 3-4 inch movements a foot, right? And remember, the best angler in the world told me the difference between them and everyone else is their ability to move a lure, which gives a lot of self-motivated, it's got a lot of action all by itself. They're with their rod and not their reel.
Wow.
And so it's the same thing here. You need multiple reach. If you can get just the vertical jig and just the jerk strip, you already know how to do. You've just tripled your ability because you've got more. You know, I was a fighter for a long time. You don't teach somebody just how to throw a left hand, right? You wouldn't do well in a ring because there's a consequence. The same thing happens when you get fishing. When all you can do is pull that line, that's all you can do. And so, yes, it is more than that. And it's thinking about it, and it's thinking about watching your fly, reading your water. That's why I said in the very beginning, how many times have you changed where you stand? How many times you change your thought process? So go into that water and approach it differently, understand exactly where those fish should be, and then approach it with a different than normal method. And it's amazing what happens, right? It suddenly changes everything. And you will not only just be pulling. When I watch the guys, when I'm fishing, the white's my favorite because there's so many dedicated streamer anglers there. And you watch them do the same thing over and over. Not only one angler, but 10 boats go the same run. And they may not come off a bank all day. And there's fish don't just live on the bank. They live off, and that river may be the quintessential streamer river of all time. It has every possible type of water, but you can't cover all waters with one retrieve. See?
Cool. Thank you.
So breaking that part just a little bit, understanding what your fly is doing. Where was it? Here we go. So understand what your fly is doing. This is really kind of what I was just beating on. Understand what the fly is doing and how it's swimming. The second you can't see your fly, you still need to know exactly you're imparting that lure's action, that fly's action. And you need to have that 3D visual of how your fly is swimming, because you're going to go out further from now on. I hope, and I hit that earlier, don't hope your fly, hunt your fly. You develop this 3-dimensional view because you practice. We don't practice fishing. That's the funny thing. We go fishing, but no one practices their fishing. They might cast in the yard, and they cast too damn far anyway because you don't fish far. By the way, for me to make a 30-foot cast is ridiculous. I fish tight. I hunt my water. I look for where the fish should be. I don't throw it way the hell out there and hope because it's a big fly, something finds it. I mean, that is just really bad habit. Go out and hunt your water. And so develop a 3-dimensional view of your fly. I mean, like I said, maybe the most important, because when you can't see your fly, you better have this mindset that the fish is near you and your fly is still moving exactly how you intend it to move. There is no hope your fly is doing what it does. Your fly is doing what it's supposed to do. That's so important. And then know what you're able to do with the fly. If you aren't hip to this, if you can't make your fly quiver, if you can't make it do multiple things, then sometimes you shouldn't be in certain flies. Because if they're designed to fish very quickly and erratically, like a lot of your bait fish and your wounded shad things, if you can't do that, it behooves you to find flies that you can swim. But that all comes from practicing your fly's movement. And this last one is just what I just said. Just because the fly's in the water and you're pulling doesn't mean you're hunting it. And it's so critical. And I can't tell you how much I beat this into my guides and everybody else I've taught. And over 47 years of guiding, I mean, this is what you do. You teach people how to swim their fly. And if you're a dry fly angler, you teach them how to drift their flies or skitter their flies or whatever. But for the streamer thing, it just seems that we get caught up on just pulling that lure, that fly back. So anything else on that before I move along?
Kelly, I had a question
Yeah.
about fishing streamers. You talked about fishing perpendicular to the shore with the streamers and then using the jerk strip. Do you ever fish streamers upstream and then also jerk strip them too?
Great question. Total miss on my part. Yeah, and I do. And matter of fact, when I'm on foot, and I kind of said this about the rods too, I missed that a little bit. I fish 6 weights on foot, 7 weights from the boat. I will not fish an 8 weight for any duration because it tears my elbows up. And I really don't think you need to. But when I'm walk fishing, I almost, if I can get in the middle of the river, if I can get where I can fish 2 edges and stuff like that, I will. But like on the Madison where I'm at, it's virtually, there's no way you're getting out in the middle of this thing. And so I fish essentially straight upstream and I fish a very short cast. I fish probably 20 feet maximum. 25 would really be pushing it. Now this is a fast river. If I'm on the Missouri, I might get a little bit more, but not much. And you're gonna fish straight upstream. And what I do is I'll target the bank first because it's much easier to spook a fish off the bank than it is anywhere. So you want to get your first shot at where you think the fish are. And they're generally, pretty shallow. And so straight upstream, maybe a 20-foot cast. And basically I retrieve with a vertical jig kind of off my right shoulder and I pull the rod, but I keep with the rod tip always. And I try to retrieve about, where I lose control, about 6 to 8 feet. When I lose control of the fly, when the fly is no longer being animated by me and the current in any way, shape or form pushes my fly, I pull it out. Because if it's not swimming properly, they'll make you and you've totally lost your chance. So I'll go say 6 inches to 2 feet from the bank, depending on the structure. I'll hit that. I move 3 foot to the right, or if I'm going upstream, I'm on the left side. I move away from the bank in 3 pieces. So close to the bank, 3 feet from the bank, 6 foot from the bank, maybe 1 more out towards the center. I'm reading the water. And then what I do is I look directly across stream and see if there's anything I can hit straight across retrieve like I was talking about earlier. And then I simply move up the same amount of distance that I retrieved. So if I retrieved that overall cast of 20 feet and I retrieved 6 feet of line, I hit all 4 points, I move up 6 feet and do it all over again. I'll cover a mile of water in 40 minutes.
So this is all done with a sinking line then too?
Yep. Although if I'm on, and here's a caveat for the sinking line thing, because of where you guys live. If you fish the driftless in some of those areas, I do not like to have sinking lines on small, placid water. I don't like Spring Creek water I don't even like to have tips. I use a floating line and I run usually about a 9-10 foot leader. And I just, my flies, I'm not fishing very deep, and usually even a dungeon or anything with small lead eyes, or again, on those creeks are not very deep. And so you don't need, most of the time you don't need the fly to get underwater barely, and they'll still eat it. If it's 3 inches underwater, they'll come, and it's a great eat. You see every part of it. And so, but I don't fish heavy flies mostly anyway. So a conehead, like a barely legal conehead, or anything, even like a mini dungeon with the small lead eyes, if it gets 3-4 inches underwater, that's fine, especially with a floating line. But on some of that, and some of the, I used to fish a lot, the Kickapoo I used to fish a lot. And up on the root system in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and some of that stuff, Trout Run, some of those rivers, they just didn't have enough volume. Trout Run, I don't know if you fish that far over, but that's kind of a mini Madison River. That one I didn't care. I could run a sinking line. But if it's placid, if it's just not, there's no structure to the surface of the water, I don't like sinking lines, and I don't think you need them. And you can also, when you're fishing straight upstream, even in water like this, you can get away with a floating line just fine. You're just not, you're not casting far enough really to be a problem. 20 foot, and people, I see people, they'll throw 30 feet upstream. Well, shit, you never get control of the fly ever. It's just coming at you so quickly. So you keep it short, you get control of your fly, pay attention to your fly, watch it, make sure you're swimming it. And the second you lose control over that, pick it up and do it again.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Okay. So into the flies, we'll go through this. And again, I put this last simply because I think if you're not fishing where you should be fishing, you don't have a chance to catch anything anyway. And if you don't have the right stuff, and again, it's not critical so much as far as it depends on your water. If you're floating line, sinking line, I personally would rather fish a sinking line all the time. I mean, it's so much easier to cast and with a bigger fly. And so, and then knowing where the fish are, the last thing you get to is the fly, but really that's what everybody wants to be the first. And as a fly designer, obviously I would like that to be the first. I think it's really critical, but I think the thing that's happened with our flies in the last 10 years or 15 years, say, but it's coming around, it's coming back to normal, is that we went too big. And so I'm going to take you through kind of my formula on these things. When you're trying to do this, I mean, when you're solely looking at triggering response, but remember, I said that's only one portion. That's just the dumb day. That's just the day where it's just crazy, super fast and fun, right? But there's more to it than that. So it matters, size matters on your fly when you're doing that. But if it's all you got, it's kind of like if you only can strip your line. And so, and I truly don't think it makes that much difference on the size if everything's right. And so the biggest thing, and I want to revert back to that Hertz wavelength and that initial stimulus that the fish gets when the fly hits the surface. There goes your Hertz wavelength, resonating out for yards and yards and yards around you. And then your fly has to swim. And so if your fly doesn't swim, that's an issue. So your fly, you got this giant, there was a point on the white when I was seeing people run 12, 14-inch flies, and you'd see them hit the water, and they do these dumbass backhand casts. They'd turn around, and the fly would float for 4 or 5 feet. And they would just float on the surface. And then they'd start the retrieve, and then they'd pretend they're a spinning rod. You're not a spinning rod. Like I said earlier, when you're doing your cast and your retrieve, for me, even from a boat, 40 feet from a boat on a huge river is a big cast. Normally, I'm fishing 20 to 30 feet, even from a boat. And I'm hunting the water, and it's a numbers game. The more often your fly goes through there right, the better chance you've got. But if you're just hucking a giant fly and hoping it, you really aren't gonna, you won't catch very many fish at all. I mean, I watch it every day. You are not a spinning rod. You have to understand your fly hits the water, it's tight, you retrieve the fly with your rod, and it's usually not gonna be a really, really long retrieve. And so you need that thing to happen all at once. So the fly's gotta swim. That's why I like flies I like marabou, there's a lot of synthetics I like too, but I mean, I like flies that when they hit the water, one pull of the rod, that fly initiates, engages, and starts to swim. And it makes, you just get way more fish on it, especially that first 5-foot retrieve thing on flies that swim. Flies that don't move the minute they hit the water, you're going to have issues with. You got to be really good to do it. And you got to have more than one size of fly. And I got up here, that top fly is a number 2 Willie Sculpin. And so it just takes you through the middle, the second dungeon. These are all sex dungeons. And so you've got, well, the middle ones are. You got a mini dungeon, and you got a 5.5-inch dungeon, and you got a 7.5-inch dungeon or menage and triple dungeon on top. That's my limit for my flies at this point. I basically hold my flies at 7.5 inches. I get immediate impact. I get immediate swim. And I really, and long before the whole White River thing started with the alleys and the giant flies, when Russ Madden and I were doing all this research back, Russ bought my store in Traverse City. Russ is one of my guides. He's one of the best fly designers in the world and one of the best, he's a great angler. But we went through the whole 8, 10, 12, 14-inch fly theory. And we did it with a lot of saltwater flies and rainbow style flies. And we had the same thing. We just didn't turn big fish on it. And I personally think no matter how much you think that fly looks great, at a certain size, it's really hard to make it just, there's a lot of room for error. I mean, you may think it's got great eyes and a great head and all that stuff, but you know, there's just a lot of room for error in a 12-inch fly. And for me personally, the 7.5 is pretty much ended it. I don't do much over that. And I really have probably caught more fish over 27 inches, 28 inches on a traditional size dungeon than all flies combined. And so I don't think it's critical. And it's kind of one of these things where, and I said this to one of the guys on the white one day when he was getting his ass kicked. And I said, are you ever going to change that fly? And he said, well, I'm after the one. And I said to him, so your theory is the one is one dumb son of a bitch, right? Because nothing has moved on that fly, not one thing. And so it was just, but there was that mentality. If it was a huge fly and you throw it out there and you see these guys throwing it a mile and just retrieving it with no thought process whatsoever. They're not looking for any depression in the water, a weed bed, a parallel line. They're looking for nothing but hope. And they throw these huge flies up. But I think it's really critical, especially if you look at this. I've got 3 styles of flies here. One's non-articulating. The bottom, we're going into a profile fly, which is this one right here. That bottom fly, this fly on the bottom is a peanut envy. That's the one that, and by the way, that's named after Russ Madden's circus peanut because that was such a great fly. I had peanut envy. And so I tried to tie one that was as good as his. I don't know if that could be done, but it was pretty close. But profile, when you go from the sculpin style flies here, especially when you get in the top, and then you get in the middle, total scope, and then you get into these smaller versions and they scale down and they start getting maybe in the right color, a little more minnowish. You can start doing things. And then you see this one on the bottom, which draws no profile. I mean, it's a low profile fly, right? And so profile and speed is generally, and that's back to that vertical jig, slowing your retrieve, but yet moving. You're still animating your fly. You're just not doing it fast, right? You're doing a vertical jig and you're just doing the fly that's swimming back in a serpentine up and down motion. I would tell you that the 2 most important things about streamer fishing is your retrieve and the profile of your fly. Because if they're not on a giant profile, they're on a different profile. And you need to have multiple, and you have to know why you're doing that. You know, if you're going fully reactionary and you go an hour without a movement, you probably need to get into something that's more profiled as a natural food source. And so if you look at this thing above it, that's a chestnut lamprey. If you fished Michigan ever, there's millions of them, right? And so, and then we've got them out here, especially on the Henry's Fork. And so this fly right here, I'm not sure, so yeah. This fly right here probably is for big fish on the Madison, the Jefferson, to a small degree, the Moen, is probably our most productive fly overall. We always start with a bigger shape and a bigger profile, but if that day doesn't turn itself into what we're hoping, you immediately go to a profile that's smaller. And generally when you drop your profiles, you drop to non-reactionary colors. And so you get more earth tone. This fish right here is a 31-inch fish. And I had fished that water. This is up north of here. I fished that water for an hour. I went up and came back through this run and I had the river to myself. And it's full sun. It's everything you'd want for a reactionary day, right? And I had a pretty close to career day on this day. I had 7 fish in that 2-foot or bigger range, and just absolutely stunning for this state. And so all of a sudden, everything goes to shit. I got nothing. I can't get a fish to move. Nothing. So I go back up and I do it again, but I can't get past myself. I can't get past the fact that I want them to do something. I'm willing them to do something they're not doing. And so I kind of just stopped and
Like a potty?
I thought about it for a second, and I put on that fly right there, that bottom fly, and I threw that fly out and I did a vertical jig where I could see the fly, and that fish came up and ate it like it was a dry fly. It had zero extreme, it had no speed. Every single fish I caught that day before that was coming at a blistering rate, like wide open and crushing the fly. Biggest fish I've got out of that river system in history comes up and sucks that thing down like it's a hex nymph swimming through the water. And it was like, wow, lights on right there. But I wasted an hour and a half trying to make the fish do what it didn't want to do. And so profile to me becomes really important. A couple other things about your flies. Remember where your fish sees your flies from. If you look at the #1 food source for trout in the United States and probably most of the world is a mottled or slimy. There's a lot of sculpin styles, but all of them have the same commonalities. They all, and by the way, all prey fish, every fish has a pearl belly. Try to find one, regardless of size. Go from your whales down to your killer sharks and keep coming down, although whale's not a fish, keep coming down, and you will find that everything has a pearl belly. Trout are ambush feeders. They have a pearl belly, which sits down in the bottom, and they have this incredibly camouflaged back. But everything they eat has a pearl belly, and generally speaking, tries not to get off the water, off the bottom of the river. Just like sculpin have a very unadvanced swim bladder, right? They have a very hard time going up and down in the water. Once they are up out of that column, they are meat, and they show that belly. So when you look at your flies, even your dark colored flies, even a dark fly, put some reflective value in the belly, because your fish is always going to see that from the bottom up. Your fly has no choice but to come from the top down, and the fish has no choice but to come from the bottom up. And so build a little of that into your fly, any reflective value you can. And then onto the color thing, because I think this is really, really critical. And so for me, the color becomes, once you've established the fly, and I don't even care if it's a profile thing or not that day, you're still going to go through your color change. And this is where you can really, really, really speed up your success rate. Because if you go and just ask the guy in the shop what's fishing, you're going to get the same fly. But I personally think color is the most important thing you can do in your fly selection, and you got to find a rotation, right? And so when I was starting this back in the 90s, and we're doing this, what I found was fishing with a guy from Columbus, Ohio, Chuck Sheely. Chuck and Nancy Sheely are my best customers in history. Guided them for 30 years. They have the highest number of steelhead ever caught in a day, the biggest steelhead in Michigan. Chuck has the biggest Chinook ever caught in Michigan. 48.5 by 28.5, crushed the state record. Nancy had the biggest brown I've ever had. Chuck had the highest number of fish. And they were just these people, right? It got to the point where everybody in Chicago and Detroit and Ohio would call me and say, when are the old people coming? It was like, because it wasn't just good for us. Everybody had great days when they were there. It was just crazy. And I asked Chuck once, you ever been someplace and they said you should have? And I was going to say, been here. And he stopped me. He goes, nope. I was like, oh my God. But I was fishing with that guy in the very beginning of this streamer thing. And he had a career day the day before, 72 degrees, rainy, 72 to 78, depending on, where we were, perfect weather, perfect water temperatures, 60-degree water, 72 to 78, rainy, but not thunder and lightning-y, great low ceiling, everything's perfect, and he crushes fish. The very next day, with the very same temperature, wind, color, water temperature, barometric pressure, can't buy a fish. And so I realized I was changing his fly, and I said, I was on my 4th fly change. And I looked down at the deck, the flies are all wet on my boat, and I realized I can't tell the difference between any of the flies. And I looked took the fly that I had hanging out of my mouth, and it's olive, because the day before we had this olive bite. And I threw the fly down and went, holy shit, I haven't changed the fly in an hour and a half. I might have changed flies, but nothing had changed because I kept going back to the well, whatever worked yesterday. And then I started making excuses. And so I immediately switched to yellow, and Chuck got a 2-footer almost immediately. And then all hell broke loose. And so this started a sequence of events for me where I kept a drying board, and I realized this rotation was really critical. And so this is my basic rotation. When I'm going through my flies, I'm looking at color first. And if you want to switch the style of fly as you're going, that's fine. But first I go through this color, and it's a simple rotation. If it's a bright morning, start bright. If it's a dark morning, start dark. But you do not get to hold a fly for more than 5 minutes. So you're going to change this fly's color. I might go on rivers that like the Madison or wherever, if I know the fish count is sufficient, that I have to have passed a fish in 5 minutes. Most rivers, if you went 5 minutes without the possibility of moving a fish, you shouldn't be on it anyway. It's probably not very good. But most rivers in 5 minutes, you have crossed fish. And I need that fish to come up and show itself, not eat the fly. All it has to do is show me. Just come up and make a spin at the fly. Sorry about that, not computer. Make a spin at the fly in some way, right? Anything, just show yourself. But white, black are opposite ends of the spectrum of the opaque colors. Then you go into your neutrals, tan, olive, opposite ends of the spectrums. So you go white, black, massive contrast. Then you go into your neutrals, tan, olive, opposite ends of the spectrum. 5 minutes maximum per fly. Then you go to your yellow, chartreuse, blue, pink. I don't care what you do. I don't care how many. This is just my basic rotation. And you can subcolors, you could do brown for tan or whatever it is. But just make sure that when you're out there, you're making a decision to change something. Don't just change the tone of your fly, and change it radically. Once you find this color, once you're on a color, it may last. If you're going to get a fly that lasts all day, it's going to be pretty. If it happens, when you get done, go buy lotto tickets and look for everlasting love, because it's not going to happen very often. I get maybe 2 of those a season where I get a sustained hold the color bite all day. It is so rare. Almost always 2 hours is maximum. Almost always. If you go longer, but you'll know. If you're catching fish, you're catching fish, you're catching fish. Suddenly you go a half hour and you haven't had anything happen. You wasted 20 minutes. You've wasted at least 15 because it's off, and you've got to start that rotation and get through it quickly. On this river, like I said, rivers I know really well, I might make 10 or 20 casts and change my fly color. Okay, so there's 2 types of flies: reactionary flies and food-based flies. And I need to understand this, because as we're going through that color change and you're looking for this reactionary stuff, remember that they're generally pretty big, pretty bright, right? And food-based flies are generally going to go into your earth tones, and they're going to go into profile. And so when you're looking at this stuff and you're out fishing and you're just having a day and you're looking around and you're throwing these flies, and remember, your speed flies are generally your reactionary flies. They're generally bigger, brighter, and faster. So you're going through your rotation. It may behoove you to, when you go from white to black, that you change your retrieve, because reactionary stuff tends to be in the fast zone. Doesn't mean you have to, but it's just something that should be in your wheelhouse. Thinking, okay, I'm ripping this fly like crazy. And again, if it comes, all you need the fly to do is show. So, or the fish, excuse me. If the fish comes up and shows, and you're in the middle of this thing, and you go, whoops, sorry, wrong direction. If you're in this thing and you go from white to black, right? Or olive to yellow is even bigger. And so when you're going back and forth, remember one is probably slower, one's probably faster. Now let's say that fish comes up and gives you the swirl. Now you have to be cognizant of one thing. What was the speed of your fly? So if the fish continuously swirl your fly, one of two things is happening. You're either going too fast or too slow. And so, and the other thing you have to really be aware of is that you did not, and this is the most common error in streamer fishing. You see the fish coming and you stick your rod out, you generally make a noise like you've been punched in the gut, and you squat. And I don't know why we do that, but everybody goes, ugh, and they stop their fly. When you see that fish coming, you cannot stop your fly. You have to keep it running away. Nothing dies in front of the fish. And if you want to see a refusal like you've never seen, kill that fly in front of the fish. So don't stop the fly. But if you know you didn't stop the fly and you know you're ripping it, and you get fish that come up and show once, twice, 3 times, and your ego is getting fed because you're seeing fish, there's something wrong still. And so if you've got the color, but you've got the wrong retrieve. So the first thing you do when you see fish come up to your fly, give them whatever color you want to choose, but we're going to pretend that we're fishing. If that fish comes up and spins around it, and you know you were burning it, slow the fly down. Don't stop it, slow your retrieve. And then keep with that color. If you're going slow, move it really fast. But change both things. Don't stick with that color and that retrieve if you're getting shows and not eats. But make sure you didn't do the squatting thing. In my boat, I probably, guide-wise, I would say 9 out of 10 times, that's what I heard and saw. And usually you would look back at me and say, did you see that? And I would say, yep, I saw it. But it's just something to be aware of. That makes sense?
Yep.
We all on the same page?
Mhm.
Ruby. Okay, so we're going through the reactionary stuff. We're getting to the end here. So change with a purpose. That's what I was just going over. Change and change often. And I put this in here, not for you, but for a guy named Tim, who called me once. He went to my streamer school and he said, man, I was killing it, but I did what you said. That's the wrong sentence. It was, I go, what are you talking about? He goes, well, I was killing it on black, but you know how you say to change? I said, well, not if it's working, you idiot. And I go, you know what, Tim, the rest of my life, I'm putting that in there. Don't change if it's working. So pay attention to your fly and how the fish are responding to it. And that's what I just went over. If they're coming up on it and they're swirling, and there's one other thing about that eat. If your fish come up and if they open their mouth and you see them open their mouth and refuse, I will almost guarantee you that you slowed your fly down. They were coming up to eat it and you slowed it down and they made you. So if you ever see a fish's mouth open, which you pay attention, you'll see it a lot, where if they don't eat it, they refuse you right at the last second. And it just tells you to speed your fly up. And it also generally tells you that they're on a food bite. If the reactionary swirl, a reactionary bite is generally a swirl, like just rips around it. Food-based bites, if you see the fish's mouth open, you might want to get into a little bit more jiggy and possibly into earth tones, because they're there to eat. That's a slow motion thing where they just come up and eat it, like that big one I showed you earlier that ate the peanut envy. That fish came up, opened his mouth a good 8 inches before he got to the fly. And keep your composure. That thing was 15 feet from me the whole time when he came up. He just came up and just ate it. I mean, you see that, you're generally on a food. And then just pay attention to the retrieve you're using. If you're using one and it's not working, change it up. I mean, if they're showing and not eating, change your retrieve. So, almost done. All right, reasons you win or fail. This is pretty critical. When you're fishing, you're not fishing where the fish are, right? To the exact first point we made. Try changing this stuff up. Try changing anything you can. If you always fish on the left side of the river, go to the right side and find a new spot. Just and every chance you get, fish the inside of a bend, because it's going to be hard on you to do that from the river. It's going to be hard to do that, to fish that inside, especially from the middle of the river. And so whoever asked the question about fishing upstream, that's where that comes into play. Fish that inside from the bottom up. And if you want to, at that point, turn around, go back through it from that spot and fish out to the center. But do it on purpose and understand what you're looking for there. Your line is making your fly hunt the right zone. I encourage everyone, you don't have to get huge lines, but if you're going down to the white, I would say take a 250 at least. And they'll carry 90% of the flies you're going to fish. And then, I mean, and then you're from a boat. I assume you guys are boat fishing down there, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. It depends. October's very seldom is your big water, so I wouldn't go above a 250. And so you shouldn't need anything, you know, radically giant flies, but whatever. But I would encourage you to have that line. and then you're not using the right retrieve for the fly, and you're not visualizing the fly. These are things that can make you fail. If you I mean, I just can't overemphasize how critical it is to watch your fly and see it and practice. I said, no one practices fishing. They practice yard casting and then they fish, but they don't go out and I just implore you to go out and just take a white fly, and instead of fishing, practice moving your fly. No one does it. No one. I've never seen somebody practice fishing. And I mean, I've done thousands and thousands of casting classes, and people will cast and cast and cast, but they don't, the cast doesn't mean shit. Retrieving the fly means something. So practice getting your control. Try to get at least 2 retrieves. Even if you're just going to pull the thing, learn to do a vertical jig. But if you can get the jerk strip and then they're the same thing, just in different aim. One's a low rod, one's a high rod. Just learn that, and you'll have multiple retrieves in your quiver, and that will immediately make you a better angler. And so, right, your fly's not right for the fly today. That's simply not changing your fly color. You know, if your fly's not right for that day, people get stuck. They don't want to. If you can't tie a knot quickly, and by the way, I didn't mention the knot thing. I use a loop knot once I've established my color. I'm using 12-pound Maxima. I guided steelhead and salmon almost all my life, and I don't never use 12-pound, I don't think, in my life. I've used 6 and 8-pound for all of them, for 10-pound maybe. These are trout. They don't pull that hard. It's more about the fly and, you know, the weight of the fly, not breaking your line and just giving you the assurance. But I use a Davy knot when I'm going through my rotation. Given that once I've found that fly that I know I'm going to stick with for a while, then I go to a loop. I do not go to the loop for the movement of the fly. I go because it never hitches, it doesn't get hung up on the side. You're going to cast your arm off doing this. And so that fly, when it hits a rock, when it's not tight to the eye, has a little bit more durability. And that's the only reason I do it. Just a little bit more durable. And then it doesn't really change the movement of the fly. When you start looking at your speed of your retrieve, that's pretty static anyway. So it's not that, it's just the durability. But go through, make sure you can tie a knot quickly so you're not hindering yourself by saying, I don't want to change that damn knot. Make sure you can tie a knot in 15 seconds or so and change your fly. And make sure you keep a drying board, a box with you or a board in the boat, something that you can see. Make sure that you have, and you should do that anyway. You should have a separate drying box for your flies, but make sure you can see that rotation. Make sure you're not going from tan to dark tan, olive to dark olive to light olive. Make sure you're making quantum leaps. You know, you should be going opposite ends of the spectrum. It'll just move you through that so quickly. Sorry about that. Okay, hunt it, don't hope it. That's the mantra. Hunt, you fish shorter, you know, just as a probably the most important thing is don't fish long and hope. Once you understand that this fish are going to be on the insides, we talked about it, we beat it. When you know they're on the insides, or you know they're in this parallel color changes, or you know they're in these weeds, make sure you hunt it and hunt it close, because you'll lose control way out there. And the natural inkling to people is throw a big fly as far as you can, and you'll probably catch something. Well, that's a really shitty way to think about it. Go out and actually hunt your fly. And finally, if it's not working, you can practice because your wife wishes you to do so. So that's all I've got for that, but I can answer questions until tomorrow.
Well, Kelly, I have a question and I'm very intrigued about it. These airflow lines that you have been working on for a number of years. Tell me about that. Obviously you can cast them with a shorter line, so the head must be kind of tight and
Well,
big
there's-
7-weight rod fan. So what would you recommend for a 7-weight rod?
I've got multiple lines with them, but there's weights, but there's 2 styles. And I also did all SA's lines. So most of those were mine before airflow. I just quit when Orvis bought SA. I didn't think I was cut from the cloth, so I left. But I liked airflow's technology because they use polyurethane as opposed to polyvinyl chloride, PVC. And the additive, the polyurethane, takes better to the tungsten, which is what you use for your sinking. And so you get skinnier lines, and they don't coil, and they don't break apart as often as the other ones. All of them, you're beating the hell out of them. You're casting a lot. And so you're beating them up faster than you would a lighter line. But my heads are 30-foot heads, and then they go, which is basically level on your 200, 250, 350s. They're a level line. And so then they go to the running line, which is an intermediate sink. It's not truly intermediate. It just doesn't have any flotation built into it. And there's no polymer put in it to make it float. I seldom get past that 30-foot range anyway. Maybe, like I said, 40-foot on the white or some big river like that where the boats, I fish alone a lot. So I don't get, I run a drag line and fish by myself probably 95% of the time. And so I don't always have the option to go follow the bank contour. So I might have to throw 40, 50 feet if I don't like to. If I can stay that 25 to 30, I like it. But while I was on the white about 7 years ago in massive, massive water, we had a 32-foot vertical rise. And it stayed that way for 10 days. And so the water was relatively clear, believe it or not. And I was fishing a lot of full sun because everything was done. That's what was, we had the big rains and plugged up the crooked and just blocked everything up. And so the Crooked Creek. And so I was watching my flies. I was casting longer than normal more often because the water, we were staying where we knew there were no trees floating by us and shit like that. And so I was watching my line and it would sink in the belly on my level 250 or 300s. And I came up with another line, it's called the shovel head. And it's a reverse taper. It has T14 at the head, and there's a 280 and a 230, or a 330, I mean. And they have extremely heavy tips. So the 280's got a 7-foot tip, which is T14, which is the fastest sink rate you can get. And then they go to 250 and then to 200. And they're just made to make your fly sink, tip your fly to follow the tip quicker. And I can, on the white, that's if it's going to be just any sort of water flow, I'm always running shovel heads. They're just so much easier to cast. And I start almost everybody on them because they feel them cast so much easier. But there's basically just the 2. And those, by the way, are also 30-foot heads. So it's not truly a head if it's integrated. So the steelhead guys get all freaked out when you say head because it's not in a separate piece, but it's an integrated head. And so it's 30-foot, but one has 7-foot, one has 9-foot at T14, and then they both go to 250 to 200, which makes that line sink its head quicker. The tip of the line sinks quicker than the back of the line. And that makes that fly drop into that zone even quicker. And that a lot of that had to do with the bigger, I seldom weight my flies. And I prefer the fly to be very, fluid in the water. and I move that fly with my rod tip. And so those flies in particular get down even quicker, because a lot of like my flatliners and bang tails and stuff like that are really made to float. And so it just makes it easier. And so, but on the white and a 7-world, I'm either a 250 long is what they're called, or a 280 shovel head.
Okay.
And I seldom, I mean, I get tennis elbow pretty quick. I mean, if I'm running those big rods, and even on a 330 head, I'll still keep a 330 on a 7 as opposed to trying to make a 8-weight flex. And so it just goes into my elbows too quick. And I say, I just don't do it.
Can I talk to somebody at the shop tomorrow about that? I'd like to get,
Oh yeah, they're all savvy.
okay, cool. We have a question from somebody that's watching, and where's it at here? And then I want to find out if we can see your video.
How
Yeah,
about, I wonder if I could send you the videos and you could.
okay,
post
you
it
can
up.
do that. You can do that. Denny Parsons is asking, is there an exception for your size theory when it comes to pike or muskie? Do you pike or muskie fish?
Oh man, I was lost in the world to muskie fishing a long time ago. And I mean, way before the world got there, before Brad Bowen and the rest of them. Brad was a good friend of mine. He was still a steelhead guide. And I was lost to that world for about 3 years. I didn't trout fish at all. And I went through the same thing. You know, Brad and Blaine and a lot of these guys, and Charlotte, one of my guys, and a lot of them became, you know, muskie guy gurus. And for me, it's just in the waters that I fish, the Tequamanon, all the Hayward, the Chip, the Flam, all those things, all those waterways. And I was exclusively a river guy, not a lake guy. But I found somewhat the same thing, that flies like Brad Bowen's hang time was just a phenomenal fly for me, as was a double deceivers before they were the Great Lake style. And we did them solely out of feather. And so, but my flies and pike, the same thing. I tend to freeze at about 10 inches. When I get above that, especially in the river, I tend just not to get as many fish. And I was fishing one day, I was filming a show at Hayward with Larry and Wendy, man, at the own Hayward Fly Fishing Company. And we got out at this guy's house who has been a muskie guy for 30 years, right? And he hands me this fly. And he says, this is my #1 fly. And it was on a jig hook, and the whole thing was 5 inches long and very, very light. And this guy's caught as many muskies as anybody alive. And he said, you know, when they're going to eat, they're going to eat. And this won't wear you out. And I've caught a shit ton of muskies on Sex Dungeon. I mean, so I still went through the transition. I really liked the original stuff of that original hang time style, which was pretty light, you know, through big profile, but lots of bucktail, and, you know, 7-8 inches long, maybe 10, but, you know, light enough that it still swam. On the lake thing, I did feel like the little bit like Bufus.com, I've been out of it for a long time, but some of the pushier flies, sometimes, especially early season, tended to work for me a little better, but I still kind of freeze up. If I'm going to run a 10-inch fly, it's going to be like my triple bunkers, things that are still light in the hand, but throw a big profile.
So Kyle, any luck with the research on the video?
Not really.
Okay.
No idea.
I'll send this to whomever. I can send you these videos. I just tried it one more time to see if the damn thing would work. I mean, I'm going to shut this. I did it all afternoon. I tested every one of them. And this happened on another Zoom, and I don't know what it's doing. But I'll send them to whomever, and you can share them out. you know, the speed ones. You can put them on the website or whatever.
Fine.
And
Are they big enough to email?
yeah,
Yeah, just email it to me and then I'll get them
right.
to people and we can.
And I have, you know, this Zoom world's kind of new to me, so I have to have somebody roll through it.
So different rods that are, talk to us a little bit about your Echo rod and how that is a little bit different. Like I would ask your guy how that would be with an H3, but you know, how is this Echo rod set up for that sinking line?
The Echo rod is an exact clone virtually of the bank robbers. When I designed the bank robbers for St. Croix, and then St. Croix simply quit making, they basically just can't, they're a massive company and they were having trouble keeping up with production. And basically, you know, they're more of a general tackle company, but they eliminated the high-end rods and kept the Imperial and the Mojos, but took away their high-end stuff, which was mine and the Legends. And so I sent those to Tim Rajeff, who's instrumental. Tim and I are very close friends, and he was the distributor of Airflow USA, and then Airflow got bought out by Mayfly Group, which is Abel and Ross. And so they brought it, and so he lost the distribution of that. But he was, you know, deep into Echo, and which is a Korean stick. But the advancements in the way that they test out rods to duplicate them is so advanced now. Basically, they were able to, I only had one rod I didn't like exactly how I wanted it. But, and so they built those out and they're coming at a grid price point and all that stuff. But basically, it's identical in overall flex zones to what I wanted. I had them soften slightly the centers. So it's very hard to feel without a line on them, but I have a very fast, so if it's a 6-weight, it's really a 6 3/4 butt and a 6 3/4 tip. If it's a 7-weight, it's almost an 8 butt and a 7 3/4 tip, but with a true to flex midsection. And so when you put the bigger fly, even if you're using a floating line on them, when you put but if you're on a sinking line, which is what they're designed for, if you do that, you feel the rod flex in the middle. When you shake those rods, because they have such a fast ass on them, it's hard to get, and they have a fast tip. So you don't really feel the center, and you shouldn't because you don't have a line on it. When you put the weight to the line onto the rod, the center of the rod will flex, the butt will not. And so the middle of the rod will flex, the tip will flex because it has to, it's smaller. And then, you know, you open your loop slightly when you do that. And when you run sinking lines and 7 8-inch flies, you really, it behooves you to open your loop and not try to cast like you're out playing dry fly, because you will wear that fly. And you only wear it in 3 places: the rod, the right side of your head, and your right shoulder.
Right.
And it eats up a lot of rain jackets. And so opening that loop is paramount. I mean, and you just really get a better delivery anyway. And so, and other than that, you know, rods have become so, they're all so good. And I mean, there's just not bad rods anymore. I don't give a shit what it is.
Right.
I mean, company and that's my liking. And just to, you know, what I like doesn't mean you like it. My head guide here for 10 years, Steve Mock, who's one of the fishiest human beings I've ever seen, one of the best I've ever seen in my life, hated that rod. Absolutely would not allow it in his boat, right? And that's just him. And I had no qualms with that whatsoever. I also designed Carrie Stevens' rods. Carrie Berkheimer. Carrie Stevens is a lady. Carrie Berkheimer's rods, his streamer rods. And they're very much different than mine. They're for the more traditional flex, they're really good walk water, you know, walk wading sticks. They're softer, they're not as fast at either thing, but they're still there's two different, I told you, I showed you that picture. I fish, even though I've worked for all these companies, when I go out tonight, if it's still dark, if it's not dark, and I go fish caddis, I'm gonna have a 1972 Fenwick Fenglass. and that's what I'm going to fish
Very
because I really like that slow rod and that I just like it. I like the way it feels. I don't cast far, but when I put that streamer stick in my hand, I want it to do something else. But everybody's different. You know, there's that Sage Maverick and that Sage Payload, spectacular streamer rods. Those came out right after St. Croix quit making my bank robber. I'm not so sure they didn't test that rod a little bit because they're very close. But there's a ton of great rods out there right now. But like I said, for me, fast butt, medium flex midsection, fast tip. The tip of the rod animates the flies when you're jerk stripping. The butt section fights your fish, sets the hook, and is really what's the driving force to your cast. Even though you might not know it's the butt, it is the butt flexing the rest of the rod.
So you've got a 30-foot head on your sink tip lines, let's say. And say you like to cast a shorter line. Walk me through, just so I understand how much line you actually have out. Are you working with 40 feet and just doing a 10-foot retrieve? Or are you coming into that head quite a ways? And then do you have to false cast to get it out?
That's a great question. Never do very seldom am I working 40-foot of line. And it would be virtually impossible on an integrated head to pick it up anyway at that point. You need to get to the color change just like you do with any of them. But what I basically do is I'm running 40 feet. Again, it's pretty rare. I'm going to retrieve to between 15 and 18 foot of head off the tip of the rod. I'm going to do a single roll cast pickup. So I'm going to come up, pick the rod, do a single roll cast, which is going to slap the fly out in front of me. The second the fly touches the water, you do your back cast. And I generally slip about 5 feet of line, letting the line go straight out behind me, and you're done. There's no false casting a sinking head.
Okay.
None. If you try one false cast, you're going to wear that fly.
Yeah.
You just,
Well, and then,
after you've done it for a long time, you'll get brave and do one. Most of the time you wear it anyway.
okay.
Just you try to do it in a single roll pickup. It's not really a roll cast. You pick your line off the water, roll it out in front of you, drift on your back cast. So just, you might want to try to go to almost 3 o'clock. And I like to slip anywhere between 5 and 10 foot of line. So as it's all straightening out behind me, I'm letting more line go. And then you stop that line with your left hand and it will automatically load your rod and you just push forward. And it's very easy. And I can tell you with complete assurance that I've never seen someone that doesn't cast a sinking line better, faster, and more efficiently than a dry line with a streamer.
Okay.
And especially newbies. They feel it load behind them. They know when to accelerate. And so they feel that line load the rod and off it goes.
Cool. Well, guys, you got anything for Kelly? He's wide open here with answers. Don't be bashful.
Second longest day of the year. It's beautiful out. Everybody
Yes.
should be wide awake.
Well, thank you, sir.
You're
Absolute
welcome.
pleasure. Delighted. I can't believe the amount of information that you shared. Totally enjoyed it.
Hey,
And,
Mark,
and I
can
would
I
say,
ask
Mark,
if you?
I would tell everyone, feel free. I get inundated with emails because of the YouTube stuff. But if you send it to the slide in, I will do any question, I'll do my very best to get to them. It's not uncommon for me to get 200 YouTube emails a day.
Wow.
I don't go through the YouTube channel. I can't,
We do
I
have
can't-
one more question, Kelly.
yes,
So
but I will answer, and I'll send anybody that doesn't get the video, I'll send them the videos, and feel free to call the shop. I'm there. I mean, I have no job anymore. I'm just the spiritual leader. The guys don't like when I try to help.
was this
But-
Kyle with the question? Kyle, go ahead.
Oh, Mark, it was me. I don't know if you can hear me or not.
Yeah, go
Yep,
ahead.
I can hear you.
Yeah, a few questions on hooks that you're using. What's your preference? Hook gap, does that really matter? A lot of stuff like that. Do you sharpen all the time?
I pretty much use, I designed a bunch of hooks from MFC, which were basically either a universal predator gap style. I like the universal predators. I like short hooks on the front. You know, I get a lot of credit for like inventing articulated flies, and it's total bullshit. People have been articulating flies for, in my new book, I put a page from, I think it's 1954 Herder's Advanced Fly Tying Catalog. They have triple articulated streamers in there. I never saw it, but the same way we're doing it today. And so I didn't invent it. But what we did do, and the reason we articulated to begin with, is we saw in these, we used to tie a lot of flies on Carrie Stevens hooks, which are 11x long. You know, they can be 5, 6, 7 inches long. And those fish will actually always hit the head. I mean, it's not a swing style. It's not a steelhead. It's not a squid eaters. These are predators that they have no way. They have to eat the fish and stun it in the head. And they actually very seldom can eat a minnow in one bite. They generally hold the minnows for long periods, or any trout or anything like that, right? And they actually let it go and go downstream and pick it up. But they hit the forward part of those heads. And so we started using B10S's way back when, trying to get a short shanked hook in the front, in which I really love that hook too. And the Universal Predators came out, and I liked that. But one thing that we came out with the 7052. I use all MFC hooks on mine now because they make the hooks exactly what I want. Basically, it's got a Universal Predator shape, not necessarily, and pretty almost exactly in gap. It's a little heavier gap hook, but I went to that 7052, which is a ring eye, vertical ring eye. So it's not flat, it's up and down. And I did that exclusively for the back hook so I could articulate off the top of the hook, right?
Yeah.
So then I started using them on the front hooks too. It's a little funky looking for me at first. It's just like, I don't know if I dig this, but I don't really see any difference in the swim. I'd like to say I do and sell a million hooks. I don't really, but it saves me having two different styles of hooks, right? And so I use those. On my single hook, honestly, my favorite hook is gone. That was that 710 Daiichi, and then they went out of favor or out of business. I don't know. But I like to use on my single hooks. I really like the fit and finish on that hook. It's a 3X long, and what I do, and I go to 3Xs because I could get the gap I like, and then I would just go one size bigger than I wanted. So I'd get that extra eye length, and then MFC, put that hook, and I started using that one. I got it basically the same length is what I was looking for before. The gap is slightly bigger on my single hooks than I like. I'll still go back and forth occasionally. I still got lots of that old hook, but for the most part, I've switched over to that one too. And now this year, I hear Daiichi's gone. Daiichi's going away, is what I'm hearing. And so I don't particularly like, in the Umpqua hooks, I don't particularly like the smaller gap. I can't remember, 93, 95s, I used to run that a lot. And I liked that gap, but I don't think it's all that critical, to tell you the truth. It's more, for me, it's more the eye appeal. I really, when the Universal Predators came out, I really got hooked on that hook, and no pun intended there. But I really, the MFC hooks, because they're bending them for me, are pretty close to what I like to see. And there's a couple I still want to change, but they're pretty damn close. Point wise, with the chemically sharpened hooks, I don't, I never don't have a file with me. And if I hit something, I touch it, and I do. I always pinch one of the two of my barbs, mostly because I have wore double hooks before, and it's easier to get them out of you.
Yeah.
And so I generally pinch my back barb down. Cause I can get, if you can get the back hook out of you, I ran a double barbed dungeon through my hat into my head once and by myself. And I'm telling you, when you try to take your hat off to see what's going on and both hooks are in your head, it sucks. And so, but if I could have got that back, and I had to just rip them out. I was on the white,
Yeah.
about 50. And so since then I've always took the back hook down. I don't really pay too much attention if on the back hooks, because I almost never get a fish on a back hook. I don't pay attention to those as much as I do the front ones, but I always carry a, just a little diamond file. And I don't,
Sure.
I'm a little nervous with hooks on the chemically sharpened hooks of going much past once or twice sharpening them. I don't know why, but they don't seem to take a point like the old ones did. And
Okay.
so, but by that time I've usually thrown it in a freaking tree anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Or they start falling apart.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I mean, it's
I'm just
something that-
curious because I have noticed that a lot of hooks started either losing the gap, and a lot of trout stuff, especially the smaller stuff.
Yeah.
Hook gap is so small, and people are wondering why they're not catching fish. And I'm like, you just got to go. Some people focus so much on the hook size, and then
Yeah.
that I'm like, well, just tie on bigger hooks. Just tie your fly
down.
smaller. Just use that bigger hook if you can. So
And
just
that's what I did with the 17. Shit, I forgot 17. I can't remember the Daiichi hook. Forgot the hook size, but basically I took just somewhere between the two, the universal predator and that, and it carries down right to the size 6s.
Time
And
for
it's
bed,
got
Buster.
that deeper gap, huh? I thought somebody said the hook number. I forgot it. There's too many damn hook names.
yeah.
I just barely got done through memorizing all the mustads when TMC came out, and that was 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Now it's
Well,
like
now
every-
there's fire sticks and everything else. So
Oh yeah.
and they're all different. You have to have a spreadsheet for all of them practically,
Yeah,
or just stick to.
I think I have over 900 hook styles in the shop,
Oh,
and I'm like,
So you heard Daiichi's going away, huh?
yes, I did.
What happened?
that's
They
true
got
now.
bought out or they're just closing the company down?
I heard it was going away. I'm not sure. I heard something about meaning Daiichi, wasn't going to do it, but I don't know if that's true or not. You hear a lot of rumors.
Wow.
I wouldn't put too much stock in it. I just heard there's a lot of these hooks coming out that are there's 7 companies from the same company. There's 7 manufactured hooks in the States that all come from the same company. And they're the exact same hook. There's different company names.
Wow.
And and I assume it's just, the leading, there's just so many out there that I just assume that it's not, there's just no money left in it here. I don't
Yeah.
know. You've got so many, sorry about that. There's so many hooks. I don't know. There's just a lot of them. And so it's probably just diluted the profit zone for them. But they've been around a long time. I really like that fire hole stick. I like those things. They're
Are they good?
yeah, I really like them. I do. It's a cool company. I don't know where they get them. I don't know what it is. Just I like them. The hook's been really comparable to the fully mill hooks. The competition hooks, especially our nymph. I mean, we sell so many nymph hooks. It's crazy. So, but they've been great. I have not had a single failure on one, and I run a lot of their dry fly hooks too.
Great.
So, and I heard some rumor about there's some new dry fly hooks coming down the pike with this, if this thing with Daiichi is going to happen or not, I don't know, but I heard there's going to be new dry fly hooks in different shades.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Does anybody else have a question for Kelly before we wrap this thing up?
Look at out the window. It's caddis time. Can't see. Look out there. You can't see out the windows. It's caddis time. I'm not going fishing. Sorry.
Everybody
Yesterday was good,
good?
though.
Well, hey, sir, I gotta tell you, you nailed it. You killed it. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad everybody liked
Thank
it.
you very much. The information was great. Opened my eyes to a few things I wished I would have heard 15 years ago. So,
Well, like I said, anybody's got questions, feel free to call. There's one thing I can do is talk. They let me do that in my own store still.
there you go.
As the guy said, you know, boss, when you help, kind of slows us down. I said, that's what I've been looking for. I've been trying to achieve that forever.
Okay. Well,
All
Kelly,
good?
thank you very much.
All right,
Absolutely.
man. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.